The billionaire's wife mocked a shy waitress, assuming the girl was uneducated. She was wrong, but this mistake triggered an investigation that shattered the husband's reality. The poor waitress was actually the anonymous genius who had saved his empire. When he arrived to apologize to her, another realization hit him. What happened next changed history. Before we start, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. The heavy air inside the exclusive L'Étoile bistro always smelled of truffle oil and old money, a suffocating perfume that Elodie Laurent had learned to associate with her own enforced invisibility. At 24 years old, she was a ghost in a black apron, drifting between tables of Manhattan's elite, while her mind resided elsewhere. Specifically, in the faded ink of an 18th-century maritime diary, she was mentally translating to keep her intellect from atrophying. Table 4 needs water, Elodie, not a statue. Henri, the manager, hissed as he passed, snapping his fingers near her face. Elodie blinked, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the silverware on her tray, not from fear of Henri, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of working double shifts to fund her mother's dialysis treatments. She was a linguistics prodigy from the Sorbonne, forced into servitude by the cruel arithmetic of the healthcare system, and tonight the weight of it felt particularly crushing. She took a steadying breath, smoothed her apron, and turned toward the corner booth, the most demanding station in the restaurant. Seated there was Julien St. Clair, the tech billionaire, whose maritime salvage empire had dominated the headlines for weeks. Up close, however, the master of the oceans looked less like a titan and more like a man drowning on dry land. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue that no amount of money could cure, and he stared at the menu as if it were a cipher he had no energy to decode. Beside him sat his new wife, Margot de Paul, a woman whose beauty was sharp enough to cut glass and whose temperament suggested she would enjoy doing so. While Julien sought quiet, Margot radiated a frantic need for dominance, her eyes darting around the room to ensure she was being observed by the right people. "The lighting in here is atrocious, Julien," Margot complained, her voice pitched high enough to carry to the neighboring tables. "It makes everyone look jaundiced. And this linen," she flicked the napkin with a manicured fingernail, "it feels like sandpaper. Did we make a reservation at a bistro or a cafeteria?" Julien sighed, reaching for his water glass only to find it empty. "It is fine, Margot. Please, let us just have a quiet meal. I have had a long day with the board." His voice was a low rumble, pleading for peace, but peace was not a currency Margot traded in. "You always have a long day," she snapped, tossing her hair. "That is no excuse for subpar ambiance." Elodie approached the table at that precise moment, moving with the silent grace that usually kept her safe from notice. She sensed the toxic tension radiating from the couple, a tangible wall of discord that she had to breach just to pour sparkling water. She uncapped the bottle, focusing intently on the task, hoping to remain part of the furniture, but she could feel Margot's gaze snapping toward her, hungry for a target. "Excuse me," Margot said, not to get attention, but to demand submission. "Do you plan to hover there all night, or are you going to serve us?" Elodie poured the water with practiced precision, keeping her eyes lowered. "My profound apologies, madame," she murmured in English, keeping her voice flat and unmemorable. Julien looked up then, and for a fleeting second, his weary eyes met Elodie's. He offered a small, apologetic grimace, a tiny acknowledgement of his wife's rudeness that surprised Elodie, creating a dangerous spark of human connection in a room built on exclusion. The vibration of the cell phone in her apron pocket felt like a branding iron against Elodie's hip bone, jarring her from the fragile rhythm she had established. It was exactly 7:15 in the evening, The precise time the billing department at Mount Sinai Hospital usually called to discuss outstanding balances and payment plans that were mathematically impossible on a waitress's salary. The buzzing persisted, a relentless, silent scream that shattered her concentration just as she reached for the salad course silverware. Her mind, usually a fortress of linguistic precision, momentarily collapsed under the weight of panic, flashing images of dialysis machines and eviction notices instead of table settings. In that split second of terrifying distraction, Elodie's hand betrayed her. She placed the chilled silver salad fork not to the left of the charger plate, where centuries of etiquette dictated it belonged, but to the right, nestled intimately against the steak knife. The metallic clink of the silverware hitting the starch-white tablecloth sounded like a gunshot in the hushed reverence of the dining room. Elodie realized her error immediately, her breath catching in her throat as she reached out to correct the placement, but it was already too late. Margot de Paul had been waiting for this. Like a viper coiled in silk, she had been watching Elodie with predatory intensity, searching for a crack in the armor, and now she had found a canyon. Margot's eyes, lined with coal and malice, lit up with a terrifying delight. She did not simply point out the mistake, she weaponized it. "Stop." Margot commanded, her voice sharp enough to slice through the ambient jazz music, causing two diners at the adjacent table to pause mid-chew. She reached out and tapped the offending fork with a manicured fingernail, the sound echoing the earlier mistake. "Julien, look at this. Do you see this?" Julien St. Clair flinched, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes deepening as he stared at the silverware with profound disinterest. "It is just a fork, Margot," he murmured, his voice heavy with the desire to disappear. "Please, let her fix it and let us eat." But Margot was not interested in eating. She was interested in theater. She leaned forward, her expensive jewelry catching the candlelight, and decided that English was too blunt an instrument for the humiliation she intended to inflict. She assumed, with the arrogance of the truly wealthy, that the help existed in a vacuum of ignorance. She turned her gaze fully on Elodie, looking through her rather than at her, and switched effortlessly into rapid-fire, complex French. "Regarde cet idiot," she sneered, the syllables dripping with disdain. "Look at this idiot. She has the grace of a dairy cow and the brain of a peasant." The switch to French was a calculated act of exclusion, a way to build a wall between the civilized diners and the barbaric server. Margot laughed, a cold, tinkling sound that lacked all mirth. "She likely thinks couture is a type of cheese," she continued, gesturing vaguely at Elodie's uniform as if it were a costume. "It is embarrassing, Julien. We spend $500 for dinner, and we are served by someone who probably cannot even spell bistro." The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. Elodie stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the table, the insults washing over her not as meaningless noise, but as perfectly intelligible, grammatically precise darts. Every word landed. She understood the nuance of paysan, the specific classist weight of idiot, and the cruel irony of being mocked for lack of education by a woman who clearly did not know the difference between the file, subjunctive, and the conditional moods. Julien looked mortified, a flush creeping up his neck as he glanced around the room, realizing that while the staff might not understand the words, they understood the tone. "Margot, enough," he hissed, his voice gaining a hard edge. "You are making a scene." But the damage was done. The air at table 4 had been poisoned, and Elodie was standing in the center of the toxic cloud, holding the salad fork that had started the war, her face burning with a shame that did not belong to her. Elodie did not flee toward the kitchen, nor did she crumble into the weeping mess that Margot de Paul clearly expected. Instead, a profound stillness settled over her, a sudden transformation that seemed to realign the very atmosphere around table 4. She straightened her spine, shedding the invisible weight of servitude, and lifted her chin to meet Margot's malicious gaze, not with anger, but with a serene, devastating compassion. It was the pitying look a patient teacher might give a particularly petulant child. With deliberate grace, Elodie picked up the displaced salad fork and set it gently to the left of the charger plate, correcting the error with the precision of a surgeon. Then she shattered the silence. "Pardonnez-moi, madame," Elodie said, the words flowing like liquid silk. She did not speak the rough, street-corner French of a tourist, but the crystallized, aristocratic dialect of the old families of Lyon. Her vowels rounded and perfect, her cadence musical. "I will correct the setting immediately." The sound of her voice hit Margot like a physical slap, freezing the sneer on her face. Elodie was not finished. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to an intimate, conspiratorial whisper that only the three of them could hear, ensuring the lesson remained private yet absolute. "After all," she continued, her gray eyes locking onto Margot's widening pupils with an intensity that burned, "true elegance is found in kindness, n'est-ce pas?" The revelation was absolute. Margot's mouth fell open in a silent gasp, the color draining from her cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. She had attempted to wield her language as a weapon of exclusion, only to find herself outclassed by the very target she had deemed beneath notice. The silence that followed was heavy, electric, and utterly owned by the waitress. Julien St. Clair felt the tectonic plates of his reality shift violently as the waitress's words settled over the table like fine, heavy dust. He stared at Elodie Laurent, really seeing her for the first time that evening, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Gone was the invisible servant he had dismissed as part of the scenery. In her place stood a woman of formidable intellect and terrifying composure. It was not merely that she spoke French. Many people in New York spoke the language. It was the timbre of her voice, the archaic and poetic structure of her phrasing, and the undeniable aristocracy of her accent. It was a specific dialect he associated with dusty, restricted libraries in the Sorbonne or the private salons of the very old, very wealthy families of Lyon, not a noisy bistro in Manhattan. He realized with a jolt of shame that this woman, whom his wife had treated like livestock, possessed a mind that likely eclipsed everyone else in the room. The contrast was physically painful. Margot, draped in $10,000 of silk and diamonds, looked suddenly small and crude, a petulant child playing dress-up, while Elodie, in her faded black uniform and sensible shoes, radiated the quiet authority of a queen in exile. Elodie did not wait for an acknowledgement, nor did she allow the moment to curdle into awkwardness. With the same serene expression, she finished adjusting the cutlery, filled their wine glasses with a steady hand, and offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Julien, a gesture that said, "I see you seeing me, and I forgive you for your silence." She then turned on her heel and vanished into the clamor of the kitchen, leaving behind a silence at table 4 that was heavier than lead. For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. Then, the spell broke as Margot let out a shrill, brittle laugh that sounded like glass breaking under a boot. She reached for her wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly, desperate to reclaim the narrative she had so spectacularly lost. "Well," Margot scoffed, her voice pitching too high. That was a quaint parlor trick, was it not? The girl probably memorized a line or two from a movie to impress the tourists. It is pathetic. Really, how hard they try to seem relevant. She looked at Julien, expecting him to join in the mockery, to validate her bruised ego, but Julien was no longer present in the conversation. He did not hear her dismissal, nor did he see the desperate smile she plastered onto her face. His gaze was fixed unblinkingly on the swinging kitchen doors where Elodie had disappeared, his mind racing with a singular, burning question that drowned out everything else. The indifference he had felt all evening had evaporated, replaced by a consuming fascination that felt dangerously like obsession. He had spent his life surrounded by people pretending to be something they were not, but tonight he had witnessed the opposite, someone pretending to be less than she was. Why would a woman who spoke the language of kings be clearing plates for a living? He pushed his plate away, his appetite replaced by a hunger for answers that he knew would not let him sleep until he had uncovered every secret she was hiding. The double doors swung shut behind Elodie, severing the link to the hushed elegance of the dining room and plunging her instantly into the chaotic, humid inferno of the kitchen. The cacophony of clattering pans, shouting line cooks, and the hissing of searing meat assaulted her ears. But for once, the noise was a comfort, a wall of sound to drown out the pounding of her own heart. She navigated the obstacle course of rushing servers and waiters to the far stainless steel prep counter near the dish pit, the only corner where she could disappear for a fraction of a second. Her hands, which had been steady as stone while pouring wine for the woman who despised her, now began to tremble violently. She gripped the cold metal edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white, forcing air into her lungs that felt too tight for her chest. The adrenaline that had fueled her retort was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, sickly residue of fear. She had just insulted the wife of a billionaire. In the real world, moral victories often resulted in unemployment. Elodie, the bark of Henri, the floor manager, snapped her head up. He loomed over her, his face flushed from the heat of the pass, oblivious to the quiet war she had just won. "I saw you lingering at table 4. Do not antagonize the VIPs with your daydreaming. If Mr. St. Clair complains, you are gone. Do you understand? Gone." He did not wait for an answer, spinning around to yell at a sous chef about a delayed soufflé. Elodie bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, swallowing the defense that rose in her throat. She wanted to scream that she was not the antagonist, that she had defended her dignity against a bully, but dignity did not pay the rent. As Henri stormed away, the phone in her apron buzzed again, a second, more urgent reminder of her reality. She pulled it out with shaking fingers, shielding the screen from prying eyes. It was a text message from the Mount Sinai billing coordinator. "Final notice. Miss Laurent, the payment for your mother's dialysis treatment is 3 weeks overdue. Please remit $3,000 by tomorrow morning or service will be suspended." The numbers on the glowing screen blurred through the sudden tears pricking her eyes. She closed her eyes for a second, picturing her mother's pale, trusting face, the way she whispered "thank you" after every exhausting treatment. This was the shackle that bound her. The momentary satisfaction of putting Margot de Paul in her place evaporated instantly against the terrifying arithmetic of survival. $3,000. She had made $42 in tips so far tonight. The chasm between the two numbers was a physical weight, crushing the air out of her. She looked at the text, then at the swinging doors leading back to the dining room. She could not afford pride. She could not afford anger. She could only afford to survive. With a shuddering breath, Elodie slid the phone back into her pocket, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and mentally reconstructed the mask of the invisible, obedient servant. She picked up a fresh pitcher of water, her face a blank canvas once more, and pushed back through the doors, walking straight into the fire to serve the people who thought she was nothing. The morning sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of St. Clair Enterprises, illuminating the polished mahogany table where 12 of the most expensive suits in Manhattan sat waiting for a reaction. Yet, for Julien St. Clair, the brilliance of the day offered no clarity. He sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on a rotating holographic projection of a seabed terrain map, specifically the debris field of the L'Espoir. The sunken galleon his company had spent 5 years and $80 million locating. The sonar mapping indicates the primary hull is intact, Mr. St. Clair, the chief operations officer was saying, his voice a drone of enthusiastic corporate jargon that usually engaged Julien's sharp mind. Preliminary estimates suggest the gold bullion reserves alone could exceed the initial projections by 40%. If we mobilize the salvage drones by Tuesday, we could have the first artifacts on the surface within the month. Julien blinked, the blue light of the hologram reflecting in his eyes, but he did not see gold bars, ancient cannons, or rotting timber. Instead, he saw a flickering candle in a bistro and a pair of grey eyes that held more history than the shipwreck floating before him. The memory of the waitress, Elodie, the name tag had said, played on a relentless loop in his mind, specifically the lilt of her voice when she had dismantled his wife with a single, elegant sentence. It was maddening. He was supposed to be celebrating the discovery of a lifetime, the vindication of his career, yet all he could think about was why a woman who spoke the distinct, dying dialect of the Lyonnais aristocracy was serving salads to ungrateful tourists. The cognitive dissonance was a physical itch he could not scratch. Julien. The COO pressed, sensing his boss's detachment. "Do we have authorization to deploy the drones?" Julien abruptly stood up, the leather of his chair creaking loudly in the stunned silence. "Suspend the deployment," he commanded, ignoring the gasps of confusion that rippled through the room. "I need 24 hours to review the logistics." He did not wait for an argument, turning on his heel and striding out of the boardroom, leaving his executive team in a state of panicked bewilderment. He marched into his private office, slammed the heavy glass door, and immediately pulled his encrypted phone from his jacket pocket. He dialed a number he rarely used, one that bypassed secretaries and legal teams. "It is St. Clair," he said the moment the line connected, his voice low and urgent. "I need a full dossier, and I need it by tonight. No, not a competitor, a waitress. Her name is Elodie Laurent, and she works at L'Étoile on Fifth Avenue." He paused, looking out at the harbor where his ships were waiting, feeling the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. "Dig deep, Vance. She is not who she pretends to be. Find out why a genius is hiding in an apron, and do not stop until I know every secret she is keeping." The penthouse at the top of the St. Clair Tower was less a home and more a gallery of sterile perfection, a sprawling expanse of white marble and chrome that reflected the city lights but held none of its warmth. Julien stepped out of the private elevator into this air-conditioned mausoleum, his mind still vibrating with the mystery of the waitress, only to find his wife engaged in a war of her own making. Margot Dupont was standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by an explosion of hydrangeas and silk swatches, her face a mask of intense concentration that she usually reserved for criticizing staff. She was planning the annual Ocean Blue Charity Gala, an event ostensibly about saving coral reefs but functionally about ensuring Margot's photo appeared on the society pages. "Julien, finally," she said without looking up, waving a swatch of fabric that cost more than a Honda Civic. "Tell me this blue is not too pedestrian. The planner suggests cerulean, but I feel it lacks authority." Julien loosened his tie, feeling the suffocating weight of the frivolous conversation pressing against his chest. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark water of the harbor, seeking the depth he felt was missing from his life. "It is fine, Margot," he replied, his voice flat. "It is just a tablecloth." Margot let out an exasperated sigh, dropping the silk as if he had insulted her ancestors. "Details matter, Julien. Perception is everything. You, of all people, should know that." The irony was bitter on his tongue. He turned to face her, the image of Elodie's calm, grey eyes overlaying Margot's frantic vanity. "Perception is not reality," he said quietly. "At the bistro last night, that waitress, she was not what she seemed." Margot rolled her eyes, picking up a champagne flute. "Oh, please, are we still talking about the help?" I had almost forgotten her existence. Her callousness was not malicious, it was worse. It was total indifference to the humanity of another person. She spoke Lyonnais dialect, Margot. Julien pressed, needing her to understand, needing to see if there was any depth in his wife to connect with. That is not something one picks up from a movie. There was a dignity about her that... Margot cut him off with a sharp laugh. "That what? Intimidated you? Julien, she is a nobody, a servant. If she had any real value, she would not be wiping tables. Stop romanticizing poverty." "It is boring." The wedge drove deep. Julien looked at his wife, really looked at her, and realized he was entirely alone in the room. He saw the comparison clearly now. Margot was the glittering surface of the ocean, beautiful and treacherous, but Elodie was the wreck beneath, holding all the history and gold. He realized then that he did not just want to know who Elodie was. He needed to find her to remind himself that he was not just a checkbook in a suit. The silence that followed was deafening, filling the space between them with the realization that their marriage was a contract, not a union, and he was desperate to breach the terms. The silence of the penthouse was broken only by the soft, rhythmic ping of an incoming priority email on Julien's tablet. He sat alone in his private study, a room lined with rare nautical maps that suddenly felt superficial compared to the human geography he was about to explore. It was 3 a.m, but sleep was a distant country he could not visit. He tapped the screen, his fingerprint unlocking the encrypted file sent by Vance, his private investigator. The subject line read, "Subject, Laurent, Elodie, comprehensive background check." Julien took a breath, holding it in his lungs as if preparing to dive underwater, and opened the file. The face that stared back at him from the digital ID photo was not the invisible servant from the bistro, but a younger, brighter version of Elodie, wearing a graduation cap and a smile that had not yet been erased by exhaustion. He began to read, and with every swipe of his finger, the carefully constructed image of the clumsy waitress disintegrated, replaced by a tragedy of wasted potential that made his chest ache. Elodie Laurent, 24 years old, born in Lyon, France, father deceased, mother Claire Laurent, diagnosed with end-stage renal failure 2 years ago. The financial records were a cascade of devastation: maxed-out credit cards, predatory loans, and a mountain of medical debt from Mount Sinai Hospital that would crush a lesser spirit. But it was the academic section that made Julien sit up straight, his eyes widening in disbelief. Elodie was not merely educated, she was a prodigy. She had been a double major in comparative linguistics and maritime history at the Sorbonne, ranking in the top 1% of her class before she abruptly withdrew in her final semester. Reason for withdrawal: financial hardship and family relocation for medical treatment. Julien read the notes from her professors, which Vance had somehow obtained. "Ms. Laurent possesses a singular talent for archaic dialects," one note read. "She translates not just the words, but the soul of the text, a generational mind." Julien looked away from the screen, staring at the darkened skyline of Manhattan, feeling a wave of vertigo. Margot had called her a peasant with no brain, yet here was proof that Elodie was likely the most intelligent person Julien had encountered in a decade. The identity gap that had opened at the restaurant now widened into a vast chasm. She was a scholar trapping herself in an apron to keep her mother alive, silencing her own brilliance for a paycheck that barely covered the interest on her debts. It was a sacrifice of such profound love and humility that it made his life of corporate acquisitions and gala planning feel grotesque. He looked back at the tablet, scrolling to the bottom of the page, thinking he had seen the full picture, But there was one final attachment flagged in red that changed everything. The red flag on the digital file pulsed like a warning beacon in the silent study, and when Julian tapped it, the information that flooded the screen caused his heart to hammer against his ribs with a violence that made him lightheaded. It was a cross-referenced IP report linking Elodie Laurent's deactivated university email to a pseudonym that had become legendary within the halls of St. Clair Enterprises, Fantôme de Lyon, the ghost of Lyon. The world tilted on its axis as Julien gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. He remembered the desperation of 6 months ago vividly, when the hunt for the L'Espoir had stalled completely because the captain's log, the only map to the treasure, was written in an impenetrable cipher of 18th-century naval code and obscure Lyonnais slang. His team of high-priced cryptographers had failed for weeks, burning through budget and patience, until Julien, in a fit of frustration, authorized an anonymous bounty on a niche academic forum. The response had come at 3 a.m, a flawless translation uploaded by the ghost of Lyon that unlocked the mystery in mere hours. The translation was not just accurate, it was poetic, capturing the nuance of a dying sailor's last words, and it provided the exact coordinates that led Julien's drones to the gold. "It was you," Julien whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and horror. My God, it was you the whole time. He realized now why the $50,000 consultation fee he had tried to wire had never been claimed. The email had bounced back, not because the user was an eccentric recluse who disdained money, as his team had arrogantly assumed, but because Elodie had likely lost her internet access or her student privileges due to the crushing poverty that had forced her into an apron. While he was popping champagne corks and watching his stock price soar on the back of her genius, she was likely counting dimes to pay for a subway ride to the hospital. The disparity was grotesque. He was standing on a mountain of gold that she had built for him, while his wife mocked her for not knowing the value of couture. The realization washed over him that Elodie Laurent was not merely a victim of his wife's cruelty, she was the unacknowledged partner in his greatest success. She was the intellectual giant who had solved the puzzle that defeated his millions, and she was serving salads to survive. The injustice was a physical weight in his gut, heavier than the sunken gold. He looked at her photo again, seeing the fatigue in her eyes, and understood that he could not simply mail a check to fix this. A check was a transaction. This required atonement. He had to go to her, not as a patron, but as a debtor. He had to bridge the gap between table 4 and the kitchen immediately. The paralyzing shock of the discovery shifted almost instantly into a frantic need for action, propelling Julien from his desk with a momentum that knocked his heavy leather chair to the floor. His first instinct was the conditioned response of a billionaire CEO, which was to call his legal counsel and have them draft a settlement agreement with a non-disclosure clause attached. But the thought curdled in his stomach before it could fully form. "No," he said aloud to the empty room, his voice harsh in the silence. "I will not send a suit to buy her silence. I will not treat her like a liability when she is the architect of my victory. This was not a corporate oversight to be managed. It was a moral debt that required a human face, specifically his own face." Humbled and apologetic, he grabbed his coat and keys, bypassing the intercom to call his driver because he needed the visceral reality of driving himself, of navigating the city streets just as she did. He emerged from his study to find Margot standing in the hallway, holding a tablet and looking annoyed. "Julien, the florist is demanding a deposit for the white hydrangeas, and you have locked the credit limit on the joint account," she said, her voice a sharp intrusion into his mission. "Where are you going at this hour? It is nearly 4 o'clock. Julien barely slowed down, grabbing the door handle with a grip that turned his knuckles white. "I have to correct a mistake, Margot," he replied, not looking back at her. "A very expensive mistake." He left her standing there, mouth open in confusion, and descended to the garage. The drive to L'Étoile was a blur of neon lights and wet asphalt, his mind rehearsing 1,000 different apologies, none of which sounded adequate for the magnitude of what she had done for him. He parked the Aston Martin haphazardly in a loading zone, not caring about the ticket, and marched toward the bistro. The restaurant was in the lull before the dinner rush, the air thick with the scent of roasted garlic and the quiet clatter of prep work. The maitre d', a man named Pierre who prided himself on recognizing net worth at a glance, rushed forward with a sycophantic smile. "Monsieur St. Clair, what a delightful surprise." "We have your usual table avail." Julien cut him off with a raised hand, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room with frantic intensity. "I am not here to eat, Pierre," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I am here to see someone." He ignored the confused look on the man's face and pushed past the host's stand, his gaze sweeping over the servers polishing glasses and folding napkins until it landed on a solitary figure near the bar. She was there, her back to him, scrubbing a stain off the mahogany counter with the rhythmic, weary motion of someone who believes they are invisible, and Julien felt his heart stop. Julien navigated the narrow aisle between the empty tables, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that felt entirely foreign to a man accustomed to the calculated detachment of the boardroom. He stopped 3 feet behind the woman who was diligently polishing a wine glass, the friction of the cloth against the crystal the only sound in his immediate vicinity. He watched her for a moment, observing the slump of her shoulders and the weary precision of her movements, realizing with a pang of guilt that she was scrubbing away the evidence of a luxury she could never afford to enjoy. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the inevitable terror he was about to inflict, and spoke her name with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. "Mademoiselle Laurent." Julien said, his voice low and steady. Elodie froze instantly, her hand stilling on the glass, her entire body going rigid as if she had been caught committing a crime. She turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes wide with the raw, animal panic of someone who lives on the precipice of financial ruin and has just felt the ground give way. She saw Julien standing there, looking not like a customer but like an executioner, and she immediately assumed the worst. "Monsieur St. Clair," she whispered, her voice trembling as she gripped the polishing cloth like a lifeline. If this is about last night, please, I can explain. It was not my intention to cause distress to your wife. I only meant to." She trailed off, her eyes darting to the manager's office, clearly terrified that her employment was being terminated to satisfy a billionaire's bruised ego. Julien stepped closer, invading her personal space not to intimidate, but to bridge the vast distance between their worlds. He shook his head gently, cutting off her apology. "I am not here about my wife, Elodie," he said, switching effortless into French, but not just any French. He adopted the specific, archaic syntax of the 18th century, the unique linguistic fingerprint of the maritime logs she had deciphered. "The ocean yields her gold only to the mind that speaks her forgotten tongue," he quoted softly. It was the final cryptic sentence of Captain Renault's diary, the line that had stumped his team for months until she had unlocked it. The effect on Elodie was instantaneous and shattering. The polishing cloth slipped from her numb fingers, drifting silently to the floor as her mouth fell open in shock. The mask of the invisible waitress dissolved completely, revealing the brilliant, frightened scholar underneath. She stared at him, the color draining from her face as the realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. He knew. The billionaire was not looking at a servant who had dropped a fork. He was looking at the ghost of Lyon, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. The fragile silence that hung between the billionaire and the scholar was shattered not by words, but by the violent crash of the restaurant's double doors slamming against the interior walls. A gust of cold wind swept through the dining room, extinguishing the candles on the nearest tables, followed immediately by Margot de Paul, who stormed into the bistro with the unstoppable momentum of a hurricane making landfall. She clutched her smartphone in a hand manicured to perfection, the screen glowing with a map application that had led her straight to her husband's illicit location. Her eyes, sharp and accusatory, swept the room until they locked onto the intimate tableau by the bar, where Julien stood mere inches from the waitress she despised. To a jealous mind, the scene was damning. Elodie looked flushed and wide-eyed, while Julien leaned in with an intensity that looked nothing like business. "So this is your urgent meeting?" Margot screamed, her voice shrill enough to shatter crystal, causing the few early diners to freeze with their forks halfway to their mouths. She marched across the parquet floor, her heels striking the wood like hammer blows. "I track your phone because I am worried about your safety, and I find you whispering secrets to the help. Is this why you defended her honor last night, Julien? Is she your mistress?" Elodie recoiled as if she had been slapped, her hands flying up in a defensive gesture. "No, madame. Please, you misunderstand," she stammered, terror gripping her throat. But truth was a currency Margot refused to accept. The commotion instantly summoned Henri, the bistro's manager, who burst from the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel. He took one look at the scene, the furious socialite, the silent billionaire, and the trembling waitress, and made a cold, instant calculation based solely on revenue. The St. Clair account paid the restaurant's rent. Elodie Laurent was an expendable overhead cost. Henri rushed forward, positioning himself physically between Margot and Elodie, desperate to contain the damage. "I am profoundly sorry, Madame St. Clair," Henri groveled, bowing his head in a display of spineless servility. "This is completely unacceptable behavior from my staff." He spun around to face Elodie, his face twisting into a mask of performative outrage designed to appease his wealthy patrons. "I warned you, Elodie," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "I told you specifically to stay away from the VIPs, yet here you are, harassing Mr. St. Clair." He pointed a shaking finger toward the service exit, trembling with the force of his authority. "You are finished here. Get your things and leave immediately. Do not clock out. Do not speak. Just go." Elodie stood frozen, the injustice of the moment crushing the air from her lungs, realizing that her intellect and sacrifice meant nothing against the overwhelming gravity of their wealth. She looked at Julien, waiting for him to intervene, but the shock held him silent for 1 second too long, leaving her to bear the full weight of their judgment alone in the center of the room. Elodie Laurent felt the fight drain out of her body, leaving only a hollow, vibrating silence where her hope used to be. The cruel mathematics of her survival had finally collapsed. Without this job, there was no dialysis, and without dialysis, there was no mother, and the stark reality of that equation paralyzed her tongue. She did not argue or beg, knowing that dignity was the only asset she had left to liquidate, so she reached behind her back with trembling fingers and began to untie the double knot of her black apron. The coarse fabric slid from her waist, a physical shedding of her identity as a worker, and she folded it neatly on the mahogany bar, the motion slow and deliberate like a funeral rite. Margot watched with a satisfied smirk, mistaking Elodie's resignation for submission, while Henri looked relieved that the problem was removing itself. "I will collect my things," Elodie whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her failure, turning toward the service exit with her head bowed to hide the tears that were threatening to spill. But before she could take a second step, a hand slammed down on the bar, not in anger, but with the immovable finality of a gavel striking a judgment. It was Julien St. Clair. He did not look at Elodie. His gaze was fixed on Henri with a cold, predatory intensity that made the manager shrink inside his cheap polyester suit. "If she walks out that door, Henri," Julien said, his voice low, level, and devoid of all emotion, "I will have my legal team purchase this building by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Henri blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on a dock, unable to process the escalation. "Monsieur St. Clair, surely you are joking." "I am only trying to ensure the quality of your—" Julien cut him off, stepping closer until he towered over the smaller man, his presence filling the room with suffocating pressure. "And by 9:15, Julien continued, articulating every syllable with lethal precision, "I will evict this bistro and turn it into a climate-controlled storage unit for my archives. Do you understand the simple physics of that transaction, Henri?" The manager turned a sickly shade of grey, nodding frantically as he realized his entire livelihood now hung on the whim of the man he had just tried to appease. Julien then turned slowly to face his wife, the movement heavy with dread. Margot was staring at him, her smirk faltering into genuine confusion, unable to comprehend a world where she was not the priority. "Julien, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice wavering for the first time. "You are embarrassing me in front of the staff." Julien looked at her, really looked at her, and saw only a beautiful, empty shell where a soul should be. "No, Margot," he said, the sadness in his voice cutting deeper than his anger. "You have embarrassed yourself. I married you believing your sharpness was wit, but I see now it is only cruelty masked as sophistication." He stood tall, creating a moral distance between them that could never be bridged. "I cannot live with a woman who derives pleasure from the suffering of others," he stated flatly, the finality of the words ringing through the silent restaurant. "Go back to the penthouse. Pack your bags. My lawyers will contact you in the morning. We are finished." The silence that followed Julien St. Clair's pronouncement was absolute, a vacuum where the oxygen had been sucked out by the sheer magnitude of his authority, leaving Margot de Paul standing frozen like a statue of salt and Henri the manager shaking in his cheap shoes. Julien did not waste a single second acknowledging them further. He turned his back on the wreckage of his marriage and extended a hand toward Elodie Laurent, not as a savior rescuing a damsel, but as an equal offering an exit. "Come with me, Elodie," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the thunder he had just wielded. "You do not belong in this place, and we have much to discuss that cannot be said over the sound of breaking glass." Elodie stared at his hand, her mind struggling to process the rapid shifting of her reality. But the instinct to flee the scene of her humiliation was stronger than her confusion, so she nodded once, grabbed her coat from the hook, and allowed him to guide her out the front door. The cool night air of Fifth Avenue hit her face like a damp cloth, washing away the scent of truffle oil and fear, and she took a ragged breath, watching as Julien unlocked the passenger door of a silver Aston Martin parked haphazardly at the curb. "Please." He gestured to the leather seat. "I am not kidnapping you, I promise, but I need you to confirm something that has been haunting me for 24 hours. Elodie hesitated for a heartbeat, looking at the luxury car that cost more than her entire neighborhood, then slid inside, the door closing with a solid, expensive thunk that sealed out the city noise. Julien slid into the driver's seat but did not start the engine. Instead, he turned to face her in the dim light of the dashboard, the street lamps casting long shadows across his intense features. "The translation of the Renault logs," he began, his grey eyes searching hers for the truth, needing to hear it from her lips. "The username was Fantôme de Lyon. That is you, is it not?" The directness of the question stripped away her last defense. Elodie slumped back against the headrest, closing her eyes as the adrenaline left her body. "Yes," she whispered, the confession hanging in the small space. "I did it on the public library computers on 42nd Street. Usually between midnight and 2 in the morning after my shifts ended." She opened her eyes, turning to look at him with a weary sadness that broke his heart. "I saw the bounty on the academic forum. I thought if I could solve it, the $50,000 would pay for 3 months of dialysis. But when I finished, the library closed for the weekend, and by Monday my temporary email access had expired, and I was working 3 double shifts back to back just to keep the lights on." She laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "I was too busy trying to survive to claim the prize for saving you." The drive to the St. Clair Tower was accomplished in a silence that felt heavy with anticipation, and when the private elevator finally deposited them on the penthouse office level, Elodie Laurent felt as though she had stepped onto a different planet. This was not the cold sterility of the bistro kitchen. It was a sanctuary of warm amber light and polished oak, a private museum that smelled of beeswax and old paper. Julien St. Clair led her past his desk to a massive glass display case that dominated the far wall, illuminated by soft, focused spotlights. Inside rested the treasures of the L'Espoir, tarnished silver coins, an encrusted astrolabe, and the rotting, preserved figurehead of a wooden saint. Elodie gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth as she recognized the physical reality of the words she had deciphered on a flickering library screen. "This is it," she whispered, stepping closer to the glass, her eyes tracing the curve of the astrolabe, the navigational tools from the captain's quarters. I translated the entry about hiding them in the false hull. Julien stood beside her, watching her face rather than the gold. "We found them exactly where you said they would be," he said, his voice filled with a respect she was not used to hearing. "My team had been looking in the cargo hold for 6 months. You solved in 4 hours what 50 experts could not solve in a year." He walked over to his desk and picked up a sleek, black tablet, unlocking it with a thumbprint before returning to her side. "Elodie, the $50,000 I offered on the forum was a consultation fee for a translator. It was an insult, frankly, born of my ignorance." He handed her the device, the screen displaying a complex spreadsheet with a final figure highlighted in bold green at the bottom. St. Clair Enterprises operates on a standard salvage contract. The individual who provides the key intelligence that leads to recovery is entitled to a finder's fee of 2% of the total haul. Elodie looked down at the screen, her brain struggling to convert the string of digits into a reality she could comprehend. The number was not 50,000, it was $4,200,000. The tablet shook in her hands as the sheer magnitude of the sum crashed into her consciousness. 4 million. That was not just dialysis, that was a kidney transplant, a house with a garden, a return to the Sorbonne, a life where she did not have to steal napkins to blow her nose. This is a mistake," she stammered, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes, terrified it was a cruel joke. "I cannot accept this. I just translated a diary." Julien reached out, gently taking the tablet from her trembling hands and setting it aside so he could look her in the eye. "You did not just translate a diary, Elodie," he said firmly. "You saved the expedition. You saved my company's reputation. This money is not a gift. It is a debt I owe you, and I intend to pay it immediately." The dam finally broke. The years of holding her breath, of counting pennies, of swallowing her pride, all collapsed in a single moment, and Elodie sank to her knees on the plush carpet, burying her face in her hands as she wept the tears of a prisoner who has just been told the war is over. Julien knelt beside Elodie, offering her a pristine linen handkerchief to dry the tears that were soaking the knees of her worn trousers. his presence a silent anchor in the emotional storm that had just overtaken her. He allowed the silence to stretch, giving her the space to reassemble her shattered reality, to understand that the $4 million was not a dream, but a concrete fact that had just rewritten her future. "Breathe, Elodie," he murmured, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "The money is already in an escrow account. Your mother's treatment can begin within the hour." Elodie looked up, clutching the handkerchief, her grey eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief, opening her mouth to express a gratitude that words could not capture, but the moment was abruptly severed by the sharp, rhythmic rapping on the heavy oak door of the study. Before Julien could stand or grant permission, the door swung open, revealing Vance, the private investigator who looked uncharacteristically disheveled and out of breath, as if he had run up the 42 flights of stairs rather than taking the elevator. He held a sealed red envelope in his hand, clutching it with a grip that suggested it contained radioactive material or a declaration of war. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. St. Clair," Vance said, stepping into the room and ignoring the breach of protocol, his chest heaving slightly. "But the final verification from the Lyonnais Municipal Archives just came through on the secure server, and you need to see the physical certification immediately. It concerns the manifest." Julien frowned, annoyed by the interruption during such a delicate moment, and stood up, brushing the lint from his trousers with a sharp motion. "Can it not wait until morning, Vance? We have just resolved the primary issue, and Mademoiselle Laurent needs time to process." Vance shook his head slowly, his expression grave and unyielding. "No, sir. It changes the primary issue entirely." He walked forward and placed the envelope on the desk, stepping back as if afraid of what it contained. Julien sighed, picked up the envelope, broke the wax seal, and slid out a single thick sheet of parchment-style paper, stamped with the official seal of the French Republic. It was a genealogy chart, a complex tree of names and dates, stretching back 3 centuries with one specific line highlighted in fluorescent yellow. Julien scanned the document, his eyes tracking from the bottom to the top, and as he reached the apex of the tree, the color drained from his face so completely that Elodie feared he might faint. This is authenticated," Julien asked, his voice barely a whisper, staring at the paper as if it were a ghost. "Verified by 3 independent historians and the Maritime Court in Marseille," Vance confirmed softly. Julien looked slowly from the paper to Elodie, his expression shifting from benevolence to a kind of terrified awe, as if he were looking at a stranger. He walked around the desk, the paper trembling in his hand, and extended it to her. "Elodie," he said, his voice shaking, "look at the name at the top. Look at who owned the L'Espoir." Elodie reached out with fingers that felt completely numb and took the heavy parchment from Julien's hand, the paper rustling loudly in the suffocating silence of the penthouse office. She lowered her gaze to the document, her eyes struggling to focus on the dense web of black ink that charted the history of blood and biology across 3 centuries. She traced the line upward from her father, a man who had died with nothing but debts, past her grandfather who had worked in a coal mine, all the way back through generations of obscurity until her finger rested on the name at the very apex of the tree, Jean-Luc Laurent, armateur, 1720. The name struck a chord deep within her memory, echoing the bedtime stories her grandmother had whispered about ancestors who were kings of the sea. Tales Elodie had always dismissed as the fantasies of a poor woman trying to dignify her suffering. Jean-Luc Laurent, she whispered, the name feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. He was the owner of L'Espoir? She looked up at Julien, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I do not understand. I knew we came from sailors, but the ship sank 300 years ago." "The company has been dead for centuries. What does this matter now?" Julien shook his head slowly, and for the first time, Elodie saw a flicker of nervousness in the billionaire's demeanor, a shift in the power dynamic that she could not yet comprehend. The company was dissolved, yes, Julien said, his voice low and precise, but the maritime charter was never legally rescinded. In the 18th century, shipping lines operated under royal decrees that granted perpetual ownership rights to the bloodline. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that burned. Elodie, under the International Convention on Salvage and the specific heritage clauses of French maritime law, the cargo of a sovereign flagship does not become the property of the finder. It remains the property of the lineage. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. The gold in that case, the artifacts, the bullion we have spent $80 million recovering, it is not mine. It is yours, Elodie gasped, stepping back as if the document had burned her. Mine? But that is impossible. It is the law, Julien insisted. But there is more, because St. Clair Enterprises formally claimed the wreck using the Laurent Charter to bypass international waters restrictions. We legally merged our operation with your dormant family trust. He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the final blow to her old life. To legalize the salvage, we had to activate the original partnership stakes. Elodie, you do not just get a finder's fee. You are the sole heir to the Laurent stake. That means, as of this morning, you own 10% of my company's entire maritime division. The room spun. 10%. That was not just wealth, that was empire. You are not a waitress, Julien said softly. Technically, you are my business partner and, in many ways, my boss. Elodie stared at Julien St. Clair, the parchment in her hand feeling heavier than lead, her mind reeling from the sheer, dizzying vertigo of sudden elevation. The concept of 10% was abstract, a number on a page, but the reality of it, the billions of dollars in assets, the fleets of salvage ships, the global influence was a tidal wave that threatened to drown her in disbelief. She looked around the opulent office, at the ancient maps and the priceless artifacts encased in glass, and realized with a jolt that she was no longer an intruder in this temple of wealth. She was, by blood and law, one of its high priests. This must be a joke, she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked for the punchline, waiting for the hidden camera crew to jump out and mock the poor waitress for daring to believe she could be a queen. People like me, Julien, we do not own companies. We clean them. We serve the people who own them. We are the background noise, not the melody. Julien stepped closer, closing the physical distance between them, not as a superior dealing with a subordinate, but as a man stripping away the last artificial barriers of class that had kept them apart. He reached out and gently took the parchment from her, placing it on the desk next to the golden astrolabe, physically connecting her past to her future. That is the old world speaking, Elodie, he said firmly, his voice vibrating with conviction. The world that told you to be invisible. The world that made you apologize for existing. He took her rough, work-worn hands in his grip warm and solid, anchoring her to the earth. But that world is gone. You are not a servant. You are the descendant of kings of the sea, and you have reclaimed your crown through your own brilliance, not through charity or luck. He looked deep into her gray eyes, his expression fierce. You never have to clear another table again unless you choose to. You never have to bow your head to anyone, certainly not to people like Henri or Margot. From this moment on, Elodie, you give the orders. Elodie looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face, seeing the absolute truth reflected in his eyes. The fear that had defined her existence for 2 years, the terror of bills, the shame of poverty began to recede like the tide, replaced by a strange, quiet power. She thought of every person who had looked through her as if she were made of glass, and realized they could never hurt her again. A slow, tentative smile broke across her face, transforming her features from weary to radiant. My mother, she said, her voice strengthening. "I can move her to a private room? Today? You can buy the hospital wing if you wish." Julien replied with a grin. "But yes, a private room is arranged." Elodie let out a laugh that sounded like a sob, the sound of freedom ringing in the quiet room. 6 months later, the transformation was complete, not just in the balance of a bank account, but in the very posture of the woman standing at the podium. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, the air thick with the scent of lilies, and the hushed murmur of the city's elite gathered for the St. Clair Foundation's annual gala. But this was not the shallow vanity project Margot de Paul had once envisioned. It was the Gala for Renal Research, an event dedicated to funding breakthrough treatments for kidney disease. At the center of the stage, bathed in a spotlight that no longer terrified her, stood Elodie Laurent. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue silk that rippled like water around her ankles, but the most striking thing about her was not the dress or the diamonds at her throat, it was her voice. She spoke to the crowd of 500 with the same quiet authority she had once used to silence a cruel table, her words echoing through the hall. "We are often told that value is found in what we own," Elodie said, her gaze sweeping the room before resting on the front row where her mother sat vibrant and healthy, weeping tears of joy. "But I have learned that true value is found in what we endure and how we choose to rise." The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. Julien St. Clair stood just off stage in the wings, watching her with a pride that burned brighter than any spotlight. He was no longer the weary billionaire hiding from his own life. He was a man who had found his equal. As Elodie stepped away from the podium, she walked straight to him, bypassing the dignitaries reaching for her hand. "You were magnificent," Julien whispered, taking her hand and kissing the knuckles. "I was just speaking the truth," Elodie replied with a smile that reached her eyes. Together they walked down the steps into the crowd, moving not as boss and employee, but as partners in every sense of the word. And in the far back of the room, near the service entrance, standing in the shadows outside the circle of warmth and light, was a solitary figure. Margot de Paul watched them, her invitation secured only through a pitying connection, clutching a glass of cheap champagne. She looked at Elodie, the woman she had called a peasant radiating power and grace, and then looked down at her own empty hands. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Kindness was indeed the ultimate elegance, and in her cruelty she had lost everything that truly mattered. Elodie glanced back once, catching Margot's eye across the sea of people, and offered a small, sad smile before turning back to Julien and the bright future that lay ahead, leaving the past in the shadows where it belonged. If Elodie's triumph over cruelty warmed your heart, please show your support by hitting the like button and sharing your thoughts below. Your interaction is the fuel that keeps these stories alive. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you are always part of our next adventure. And please, send this video to someone who feels invisible today. Remind them that their true value is a treasure waiting to be discovered, and that kindness is the only luxury that truly matters. Until next time, thank you for watching.